Thank you. Before I start, how many people have seen Eyes on the Prize? Whoa, thank you. Did most of you see it on television? Or really? Oh, that's great. And this is both the first and the second series, or just the first? Just one? Okay. Two, also. Great, okay. How many of you saw the Malcolm X documentary? Wow, this is amazing. And you saw that on the air also? Okay. Wonderful. Okay. And when I finish, I'm also going to show you a book. I wonder if no, I left it down there. A book that we did on Malcolm X. We always do books at Blackside, which is the production company in Boston that did Eyes on the Prize, the 14-hour series. But we also do books that go along with it. And so we have this wonderful photograph book on the Malcolm X on Malcolm, with pictures of him and also many, many excerpts from the transcripts that we used in the Malcolm X documentary. But anyway, okay, that's another matter. What I'm going to talk about today is really leadership development. And it's leadership development, first of all, in terms of Dr. King and what begins to develop him in the context of the Montgomery bus boycott, but also in terms of youth leadership and what happens within SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, to which I belonged, and which was the outgrowth of the student sit-in movement in 1960. Now, to think about leadership as a product of a couple of things, one being the events that those leaders are involved in, and secondly, the people with whom those leaders surround themselves. And so if you take the Montgomery bus boycott, for example, it's 1955, then Reverend King is only 26 years old. And I remember how amazed we were when we were doing the Eyes on the Prize to get a picture of what then Reverend King looked like at that time. He looked like he was 15 years old with a little mustache. And it was amazing because you always had this vision of him as just, this humongous person and stuff. He looked like a little boy. And he's just gotten to town, which is one of the things that you hear in Eyes on the Prize. You begin to see his brilliance and his capacity to lead and his commitment. But none of these are yet fully formed. And what helps to form them with him are the people of the boycott. They are the regular folks, they're the foot soldiers and the leaders, the people who set strategy and also who are just the walkers. And the danger of not knowing that these were the kind of folks who helped develop leaders is that we sit around and we think, oh, if only Dr. King were here, things would be different. He'd know what to do. But in fact, another person of Dr. King's stature and amazing brilliance and capacity to lead may not come around in our lifetime. But see, the people of the boycott didn't know how great Dr. King was going to become. And so they thought they had to do it for themselves. Okay, who were they? You take somebody like Mrs. Rosa Parks. She is portrayed as I knew her when I was growing up, which is still as this poor little tired string seamstress, just couldn't get up off the seat, tired from working and stuff. If we continue to portray her in that way, we deny to her the purposefulness and the greatness of her act. That in fact, this was an act of resistance. This was an act of defiance against an unjust law. And one of the things that we tell you in Eyes on the Prize, for example, is that she had done this before. In fact, she did it in the late 1940s with the same bus driver. But for whatever reason, he decides to go the distance with her and have her arrested this time. We also tell you that she's a secretary with the local NAACP. She is head of its youth chapter. This is a woman who has a standing within the movement in Montgomery in her own right. She works under a man named Mr. E.D. Nixon, who is himself an organizer. Who is Mr. Nixon? He's an organizer with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And this is the black trade union, the black labor union, organized by Mr. A. Philip Randolph, who in fact organizes the 1963 March on Washington that Dr. King speaks at and does his I Have a Dream speech at it. But back then, Mr. Nixon is working for this Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And one of the ways the news gets out, these are all the porters who are on the trains crisscrossing the country. And again, to remember that this is 1955. So when they get to Chicago or they get to wherever, they're not staying at the Holiday Inn or the Days Inn or wherever because they're not allowed to do that. So they're staying in black guest houses in the black community around the country. And in fact, one of our advisors talked about how one of the ways that the news of the boycott gets out is because these black porters are sitting around these tables talking about, do you know what Brother Nixon's doing back in Montgomery? And in fact, one of the largest, if not the largest, fundraiser that is given for the boycott, the Montgomery bus boycott, is given, organized by Mr. A. Philip Randolph and a number of labor unions in Madison Square Garden in New York City. Now, another person whom we should remember, this is Joanne Robinson, and she's co-chair of something called the Women's Political Council. And this is a network of African-American professional women in Montgomery. It includes the teachers of the segregated black schools, the black businesswomen in the community, in the black community. And it's interesting because we were originally going to do Eyes on the Prize as a 2-hour documentary back in 1978. It's now 14 hours, who knew? But when we were looking at it, I was looking through Stride Toward Freedom, which is Dr. King's account of the bus boycott. And in it, I find this name, Joanne Robinson. So I'm thinking, a woman, hey, because hadn't been too many as we've been going through this. And so I tried to find her. I called the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which is Dr. King's organization. Nobody knew where she was. I called people in Montgomery. Finally, somebody told me that they thought that she was a teacher in Los Angeles. So I'm trying to figure out, okay, but nobody had a number for her. And then I remembered something that one of the old black reporters at the New York Times told me, a friend of mine, who said, sometimes, Judy, people are listed in the phone book. Yeah, she was. So I looked her up, I find her, and she is just too thrilled that I'm asking her about this. And this is when you're doing a documentary like this, what you try and do is what we call pre-interviews. And these are the interviews that you do, usually over the phone, and sometimes in person, if they're close enough to you and you have a lot of money. And what you're trying to do is to find out, first of all, a lot of information. Because in fact, when you're doing a historical documentary, if it's current, within the time of people still being alive at that time, then a lot of the information you find comes from the people even more than it comes from the historical books. So I'm talking to her, first of all, to find out a lot of the background information in terms of shaping this Montgomery section, but also to find out if she would be a good interview if we decided to shoot her, to film her. So she starts telling me the story, only part of which is in Eyes on the Prize. And she talks about how when Mrs. Parks gets arrested, she is called by one of the people who was around Mrs. Parks at that time and says, Mrs. Parks is arrested. She then calls her co-chair of the Women's Political Council, who says, we have the plan, let's put it into action. And what they meant by this was that, in fact, there had been other black people who had refused to abide by the laws of segregation. But they were waiting for the absolute perfect case around whom all black Montgomery could galvanize, and that was Mrs. Parks. Now, when they find out, then Mrs. Joanne Robinson is a professor at the local black college, Alabama State. So she goes under cover of night to the college and pumps off 35,000 leaflets. Now, for those of us old enough to remember, this is before Xerox, right? We're talking mimeograph machine, right? 35,000 leaflets. Doesn't go to bed that night, as she says. The next morning, she takes another student with her because one had been helping her. Another student with her. She's driving. The student is on the side, in the passenger side. And they get to each of the black schools. And she said a student was, and this is the part that's not in Eyes, a student was standing there waiting for her. And she said without a word being said, X number of leaflets gets passed to the students. And they go into the school so that by the end of that day, all of black Montgomery knows that A, Mrs. Parks has been arrested, and B, that the Women's Political Council has suggested a one-day boycott of the buses. Okay, Mrs. Parks is arrested on Thursday night. The Women's Political Council gets the leaflets out. Friday night they're in the school. Saturday, the black ministers meet. And they decide that they're going to preach about a one-day boycott on Sunday. They do that. Monday comes, nobody's on the buses. Okay. Now, how do they keep this going, though? Originally, first of all, by the way, this was going to be only a one-day boycott. And what they were really organizing for was just a more humane form of segregation. Because, in fact, Julian Bond, who was the off-camera narrator for us, originally he was going to be on camera as a narrator. And we had him go through what you were going to have to do if you were a black passenger in Montgomery at that time. What you'd have to do is to board the bus at the front, pay your dime, then you'd have to deboard and walk on the outside to the back of the bus, because you weren't supposed to pollute the white section going through it. Get on the back of the bus and then stay in the colored section. And there was a line. There was the white section in front, and there was the colored section in back. And then there was this gray area that people could sit in, and in fact, black people could sit in, as long as white passengers didn't get on. And in fact, it's in this gray area that Mrs. Parks is sitting when she's arrested. And the whole thing that they're saying when they do the boycott is, just make it so that if this gray area is there, if black people are sitting in this gray area, do not make them move for the white passengers who get on. Now, had the bus company gone for this, they could have had segregation a little bit longer. But no, stupid. No. I mean, because the point is that African American ridership was 2/3 of the bus ridership. So what happens? They go bankrupt. And it's one of those times when you realize the irrationality of racism. Now, the other thing is, the other point is that a lot of times when I talk to young people, it's like, why'd you all take it for so long? You know. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the violence and the intimidation that was meted out against black people who did stand up, but also the fact that they always stood up. One, sometimes 10. And one of those times, one of our other advisors, Dr. Robin Kelly, who's a professor now at University of Michigan, has started doing some preliminary research into boycotts. And he's done it in Birmingham in just 1 year, from 1940 to 1941. And what he found in going through this, just preliminarily, was that there were 50 recorded acts of incidents of black people refusing to abide by bus segregation in one form or another. And these are only the recorded acts. And in fact, he said there was this one man whom he found in the records who was put off because he would not abide in one way or another by the segregation. This is, again, between 40 and 41. Gets put off the bus, stays at that bus stop. And so every time the bus comes around, he tries to board it. Bus closes on him, goes off, they come back around, he's still there. Now, to understand that he's doing this when there is no movement, when he's by himself, when he understands what jeopardy he's putting himself in, but he continues to do it anyway. Okay, how do they stay off the buses, though? Because, in fact, the community develops an elaborate, organized system of transportation. And I remember when we were talking to Mr. Rufus Lewis, who was one of the heads of transportation for the bus boycott, we asked him just offhand, how many people did they carry during the bus boycott? And he said, 8,000 to 10,000. And he said it like he was saying that the sun was going to come up the next day. In fact, what he was saying was that they organized a system of transportation that carried 8,000 to 10,000 people every day for 381 days, which was the length of the boycott. Now, how did they do it? One of the assistances they got was from the black cab companies, which, up until the city takes out an injunction against them, is carrying black riders for very much lower fares, allowing carpooling, allowing a lot of things that will allow them to be part of the boycott. Then there are the volunteers. So if you had, say, a Joanne Robinson, then in fact she would say, okay, I get off, I leave the college at 5 o'clock. I can give you 3 hours. Myself and my car, where do you want me to go? And so the dispatch office would then send her around the city. You had somebody like a Virginia Durr, white woman who is the wife, as a matter of fact, of attorney Clifford Durr, who is one of the attorneys who goes to get Rosa Parks out of jail, along with Fred Gray, the black attorney. And his wife, Virginia Durr, had been one of those really staunch Southern white women who was trying biracial committees in the 40s. I mean, and to think about what that meant to be going so far away from the mores of your community because of your principles, and the kinds of things that then came down upon her for that. But in any event, she's still alive, by the way. She's 90-some years old, still strong. But in any event, so there were people like these. But the bulwark of the boycott is really the domestics. And we call them the walkers. And in fact, again, to understand, this is 1955 Montgomery. So even if you have college degrees, if you're going back to Montgomery and you're not working within the black community, you're not working downtown because you can't work in the phone company except as domestics. You can't work you're not salespeople in the phone company or the electric company or any of the department stores. So in fact, you were working as maids in homes. And one of the people I remember we asked about the boycott was a Mrs. Gussie Nesbitt. And we asked her why she kept doing this, why she kept walking these 381 days. And what she said was, I'm not doing it just for myself. I'm doing it for my children and for my children's children. And this is a constant theme of the movement. It is that sense that you have a responsibility for those who are coming behind you. And these are the kind of folks who helped form Dr. King. That is that sense of leadership as this constant flow of energy, of commitment between the leaders and the troops, so that each is helping the other to become the best that it can be. And there's a story that Dr. King used to tell, and it was about his being about 6 months into the boycott. And he said that he was very tired. And he had just come off the podium at one of the nightly mass meetings that they held at Holt Street Baptist Church. And so he's feeling tired. He comes out of the pulpit and he sees an older woman. And he looks at her and he says, he's also wondering, are we going to win this? Is this really going to work? And he looks at her and he says, oh, Mrs. Johnson, I know you must be tired. And she looks at him and she says, well, Reverend King, my feet is tired, but my soul is rested. And what this does is it re-energizes him. Now, let me talk for a minute about how I get involved in the movement. Who I was at that time was an 18-year-old student coming out of Tarrytown, New York, which is about 25 miles north of New York City. I lived in the Under the Hill area, which is where all the black people lived in Tarrytown, right by the railroad tracks. We have a Fisher Body, a Chevrolet plant in Tarrytown. And my father, in fact, was an organizer of the UAW, the local in Tarrytown for that plant, and was treasurer of the local. When I grew up, and it is still true in Tarrytown, there were no black-owned businesses, except a shoe repair shop. There were no black dentists, no black doctors. I had no black teachers. And in fact, to understand that where I was growing up, there were no black people with any political or economic power, and that's very important in terms of what draws me to SNCC and the student movement. One of the strongest images I have of my high school career was being in an advanced placement history class in 10th grade. And I was the only black student in the class. And we were doing a chapter on Reconstruction out of what I later found out from one of our other advisors on eyes was the prescribed textbook nationally at that time. And what it had, by the way, how many of you know Washington Irving, the author Washington Irving? Okay. In fact, this is Washington Irving's home. So I went to Washington Irving Junior High School. I went to Sleepy Hollow High School. Yes. And our football team was called the Headless Horsemen. I know. That's what the other team used to do with us. Thank you. Yes. But in any event, so I'm sitting in this advanced placement history course, and we're doing this section on Reconstruction. And the only portrayal of Reconstruction is a cartoon. That's the only illustration I get, or my white classmates got. So it's in this cartoon that I see supposedly a black state legislator, and he has his bare feet up on the desk of the state legislature, hair all disheveled, clothes torn and tattered and whatever. And I didn't get anything in this chapter, nor did my white classmates get anything about Blanche K. Bruce, who is the African-American during Reconstruction, who is an esteemed legislator during that time and becomes lieutenant governor of Mississippi at that time. I didn't get anything about the progressive educational reforms that come out of Reconstruction, which in fact mandate the first public education many of these southern states had gotten, that opened it up not only to the freed slaves, but also to poor whites who had been denied public education before this time. I did not get any of that. The message I got was the same message that my white friends got in this class, and that was that this is what happens when black people are put into any position of authority or control. Now, fast forward 3 years, and I'm now at Swarthmore College, esteemed Quaker college in Pennsylvania. And there was a campus group that had organized demonstrations of busloads to help on demonstrations in Cambridge, Maryland, which was on the eastern shore of Maryland. And in fact, this project in Cambridge, Maryland, organized by one of the local leaders there, was a SNCC project. And just because I'm finding a lot of people don't remember what SNCC is, let me just say, SNCC was, again, the group that grows out of the 1960 student sit-ins that grow up all around the country. This is me, by the way, in 1963, looking vacantly out at a sit-in in Atlanta just before we all got arrested and got put in jail. And so the other people, though, and I'm saying this because SNCC was very much a youth leadership development group. I mean, that's what we thought. We were just working for voter education and public accommodations and change, because it really, and I'll talk about that in a minute, because it wasn't just about integrating the lunch counters. But what we were also doing, unbeknownst to ourselves, was developing ourselves as leaders. Now, one of the other people who comes through, I'm just going to mention a few people who come out of SNCC. This is the front page of a New York Times magazine, cover story done on somebody named Bob Moses. And what it says is, "We shall overcome this time with algebra." It's a major article done on what is called the Algebra Project. Bob Moses was the head of our Mississippi project. And in fact, in 1961, he leaves Harvard University, had been doing his grad work there, and goes down to Mississippi to help work on voter registration, which he is told should be really what we work on, because there's a local organizer there who says, you all young people can do what you want around sit-ins and stuff, but I think the next piece is going to be voter registration. So that's what Bob does. Now, in fact, Bob was also a MacArthur Genius Grant awardee. And the MacArthur Genius Grant is an award given by the MacArthur Foundation out of Chicago to people whom they think have lived such wonderful lives and lives of achievement that they give them $250,000, $300,000 to do whatever they want to do. You don't have to do reports, you don't have to show up, you just have to have done good things. You can't even apply for it. And in fact, what Bob does when he gets the money is that he starts what is called the Algebra Project, which is in about 300 to 400 intermediate schools around the country now. And what it is, his thing was that it's the older literacy was reading and writing, particularly for Black and Latinos. That in fact the newer literacy is math. And so what he has developed is a way of teaching math to African American and Latino young people in the inner city. So that's Bob Moses. Another person who comes out of SNCC, Jennifer Lawson. Jennifer Lawson is head of all programming for public broadcasting. And in fact, this is the cover of the lifestyle section of USA Today. Comes out of Birmingham, Alabama. And Jennifer is also called, by the way, the Czarina, because she's a woman, so she can't be the Czar. It's called the Czarina of public broadcasting. And it says under the caption, "Early preparation, PBS programmer Jennifer Lawson attributes much of her success in television to her civil rights background, which taught her to focus on goals, not barriers." Okay, that's Jennifer. This is Jennifer also in a Town Magazine report. Okay. Now, another person who comes out of SNCC is from Southwest Georgia, Albany, Georgia. And some of you may know Sweet Honey in the Rock. Okay. This is, by the way, an ad for a Bill Moyer special that was done on Bernice. This is also the cover of Ms. Magazine. Now, in fact, she comes out of, this is also her in last month's Time Magazine, because she just did 26 hours on gospel music for National Public Radio. She's also head of Black Family Life for the Smithsonian. But the reason she got to where she is because she comes out of Albany, Georgia, was part of the NAACP youth movement, and then joined SNCC, and helps to form what is called the SNCC Freedom Singers, which helps to do fundraising in the northern projects. So, there was also Dottie Zellner, and I'll just mention, I don't have a picture of Dottie, but Dottie is somebody who comes out of SNCC, young white woman from New York City, and is now working for the Center for Constitutional Rights, which is an advocacy group for poor people. All of these people come out of SNCC, and it's because understanding that even when SNCC went under, and we dissolved for a number of reasons, all of the people who were in it, a lot of them carried the commitment and the sense of struggle with them in whatever areas of work they then continued in. So those are some of the people who were in SNCC. Okay. Okay, back to Cambridge, Maryland. It's 1963, and I'm now on this demonstration. Now, I went on a lark, not because I was particularly committed, because I had no sense of what I was doing. It was that I was 18 years old, I was away from home for the first time in my life, and I figured I could do whatever I wanted to do. So I went on this bus, an hour and a half away, and
got to this place that we were supposed to be trying to desegregate, and it was called the Choptank Inn. It was a place that was dark, dirty, and smelled of rot gut liquor. And when I looked in it, as we were trying to get in, I couldn't understand why white people wanted to get in here. Much less why I was going through all this stuff, right? But what I found was that there was this big burly guy who was telling me that I could not come in there because I was black. And all the little slights, all of the subtle racism that I had grown up with in Tarrytown, suddenly they were out in the open, and they were embodied in this man. And for me, luckily, what I had was a vehicle through which I could constructively struggle against all of that. So, I end up being in jail more on the weekends than I'm at Swarthmore, and that's a whole other story. In the end event, what draws me to SNCC, though, is seeing people who were brilliant strategists, who were organizing communities and voter registration campaigns, who were running mass meetings and getting the community involved at great risk to themselves. And it's important to understand, I mean, I was 18 years old, right? I could go back to Tarrytown, New York. In fact, in the communities where we were helping to organize, that's where these folks lived. Their lives and their livelihoods depended upon what they did in those communities. And so they were in much greater jeopardy and were putting themselves at much greater risk than I was. But yet they were getting involved. And I was also finding young people who were absolutely committed to the movement. And in fact, at that time, because I still have some of the pay stubs, we were getting, if you were on staff, and a lot of people weren't even on staff, if you were on staff with SNCC, you got $10 a week, which ended up being $9.64 after taxes. So a lot of times, people talk about the folks around President Kennedy being the best and the brightest. But in fact, when I got to SNCC, what I found was the best and the brightest. A lot of them looked like me, most of them were my age, and they were changing the world as I knew it. And I thought I died and gone to heaven. Now, the thing that holds us together, though, is not only the commitment that we had, it is also the caring that we had for one another. And one of the reasons that caring is so strong is because we only had each other. Because, in fact, it was a time when the Senator Eastlands and the Senator Stennis's of Mississippi were in control of the key House congressional committees. The House Rules Committee, the Senate Appropriations Committee, the Foreign Relations, the Armed Services Committee. So in fact, and the reason they were in control is because they had such seniority, and of course the reason they had seniority partly was because black people were not allowed to vote. But anyway, these are people who'd been in for 20, 25 years. And so it meant that if you were another legislator, or if you were even a president, you had to worry about upsetting some of these people who could control whether or not your legislation got through. Now, that was the federal level. On the local level, what you had was people who were very openly associated with the Klan or the White Citizens Council. And this went all the way from the people who were the Chambers of Commerce, or the people who were the sheriffs. And in fact, one of the problems we had with the FBI was that a lot of the local FBI agents had come out of these very law enforcement agencies that were so tied into the Klan. And that we knew when you gave them information, oftentimes it went right straight to the Klan. So this was the kind of close society in which we were working. And to get a sense of this, in 1961 in Mississippi, Herbert Lee is the NAACP organizer, state secretary as a matter of fact. And he is shot to death by a white Mississippi state legislator named Mr. E.H. Hurst. Lewis Allen, another black person from Amite County, says that he will testify, and he finally comes forward 3 years later because Bob Moses was trying to get people to testify. And Mr. Allen says, yeah, I'll testify, but only if I can get some form of protection, because he knows what could happen to him. So Bob Moses goes to the Justice Department, John Doerr, and says, and this is in a wonderful, by the way, book that is called Memories of the Southern Civil Rights Movement. It has wonderful documents from the movement, has photographs, and so the original deposition that was typed on those little manual typewriters is in this book as well. But what Bob says was, okay, give him some protection. John Doerr goes to the FBI, and the FBI says, no, we can't protect him. Because number one, if we protect him, we'll have to protect anybody else who comes forward, and we just don't have the manpower for it. Number two, they're probably going to kill him anyway. And all of this is in the deposition. So Mr. Allen testifies, and 3 weeks before we are to get him to Chicago out of harm's way, he is in fact shot and killed. This is the atmosphere. Of course, nobody was ever charged with the crime. This is the atmosphere that we're dealing with at that time. Bob Zellner, a young white guy from University of Alabama at Tuscaloosa, was on staff when I got there. And in fact, Bob Zellner is still a slow-walking, slow-talking guy from Alabama, still chews tobacco. And when I first met him, I thought he was on the other side. But in fact, he was a SNCC staff worker. And he talks about being at a courthouse, having organized with some other workers the community in Macomb, Mississippi, to try and register to vote. And he said, suddenly, as all these people are lined up, because they would put you through hoops trying to even get on the list to try and register. And one of those things was that you had to take a test, and it wasn't just a literacy test. You also had to take a test that forced you to interpret any one of over 300 clauses in the Mississippi State Constitution to the satisfaction of the white state registrar. Now, many of the registrars in these counties could not read and write themselves, but it did not matter, because none of the white people trying to register were given the test. All of the African Americans were. Okay, so they're all lined up, and he said out of nowhere came this mob, and they started to beat everybody. And he said as he started to go down for the last time, he saw out of the corner of his eye this FBI man. And he knew he was FBI because he was all besuited, and he had this little tie, and it was, 90 degrees in the heat. And so he said, FBI. So he then blacks out, and he wakes up in the hospital. He has this big patch over his eye because Bob almost lost his eye in this beating. And one of the first visitors to come to see him is this FBI man, who nervously says to him, Mr. Zellner, don't worry about a thing. I got it all in my notes. Now, to remember that this was a federally protected right, that this was they were on courthouse steps trying to vote, which was federally protected. And the FBI stood and took notes, which was my experience all the way through the movement. Okay, now, I also remember my first staff meeting, and that was in Atlanta in '63, and all of these, I'd just gotten to SNCC. All these workers are coming in from all over the field, and they're battle weary. They're coming from freedom houses that had gotten shot into, from churches having tried to organize meetings where people are, burning churches and whatever. But they're coming in to talk about strategy, and also to talk about the kind of research that we had to do as we were moving forward in our communities. And we had a whole research department organized by a guy named Jack Minnis. And I have somewhere down here the book that we did when we started the 1964 Mississippi Project, as a matter of fact. We always knew, for example, who the Chamber of Commerce was in any one town, what the major industries were. We sometimes, as a matter of fact, bought stock in some of it, like in Dan River Mills in Danville, Virginia, so that we could, in our puny little way, raise certain issues from the floor of the stockholders' meetings. There was a whole concerted effort to know who were the powers that be in any community that you were trying to organize, as well as, of course, also knowing 2 ways out of town, which was very important. So we're talking about all this. We're talking about, if I have a problem here, what are you doing? If I'm in Macomb and you're in Selma, have you run up against this problem? How did you overcome it? So in the midst of this walks this tall black guy, and I don't know who he is because I'm new to the organization. And he walks on stage, and I see a lot of people get up to him and start to hug him. And I say, well, who is this guy? And somebody near me says, oh, that's Jimmy Travis. Now, I knew that Jimmy Travis had about 3 months before been shot in the neck and in the shoulder, and had almost died. And this was his first meeting back since this had happened. And what I realized, and I realized this later, is one of the things they were trying to do when they were hugging him was to tell him that his pain was their pain, but also, very importantly, to get him not to be immobilized. And that was very important because we were working in communities which very much were at risk. And again, to understand, I could go back to Tarrytown, they couldn't. So that it was very important for the black community where we were organizing to know that that particularly that violence would not stop the movement. But it was also important in terms of the message that you gave to the white community that violence would not stop the movement, but also that if you downed one of us, 10 would come in our place. That was very important, that they couldn't just off one and then get rid of the movement. The sense being that we were a community, and that was very important. It wasn't just the commitment, we had a caring about one another. And let me just mention also the thing about women, because there's some books now that are used academically that make it seem like, we were just overwhelmed by sexism in the movement. Now, yeah, there were absolutely sexism. In SNCC, in every other organization, it was 1964, I mean, hey. But what was interesting was that, and I don't know how it was in other organizations, but I do know within SNCC that I was nurtured by the men as well as by the women, and that all of the women I knew, and I'm going to talk about a couple of them, were strong, they were independent, they were intelligent, and they were creative. And that these were qualities that were not only encouraged, they were assumed. And the reason that those qualities were assumed is because this is what you needed to survive. I mean, if you were a man, you did not want a woman behind you taking your back who was just going to say, oh, I don't know what to do, what can I do? You don't need that, because it's about survival. And in fact, sometimes I think, in terms of that experience, about the last line of a poem by the famous poet June Jordan, who says, a righteous mouth ain't nothing you should hide. Those were the kind of women that I knew in SNCC. So, as young people, though, who develops us? One of the most important people, and there's a picture of her in this book, is Miss Ella Jo Baker. And I don't know how many of you can see her, but this is Miss Baker. And in fact, my memory of her is of always guiding us with questions. She had been in the movement for forever. It's funny because when I met her, she seemed very old to me. And in fact, she was actually probably younger than I am right now, but she seemed very old. And she used to sit there in the meetings and always prod us with questions. It was always a sense, okay, if you do this now, what's going to happen 3 months from now? What's going to happen 6 months from now? Is the community able to withstand the kind of violence that's going to be meted out against it? Have you figured out the repercussions of this action a year from now? It was also always reminding us of our responsibility to the local community where we were organizing. And most important, it was the sense that we were not the leadership, that we were just organizers. And the fact that what we were creating was strong grassroots leadership that would survive even our deaths. Now, what is her history? First of all, she was organizing consumer co-ops in Harlem in the 1940s. She was a field secretary for the NAACP in the 1940s also, organizing in Mississippi, a lone woman going through Mississippi organizing chapters, which is the reason when Bob Moses from Mississippi goes to Mississippi, she's the one who says, the person you should contact is Amzie Moore, head of the Cleveland chapter of the NAACP. In 1956, she is one of the organizers of Northern Support for the Montgomery bus boycott. And then when Dr. King and a number of other black ministers form the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, she becomes its first temporary executive secretary. Now, why temporary? Because she is A, woman, and B, not a minister. But it's in this capacity that she says to Dr. King, when the sit-ins jump off all over the South, she says, look, we need to get these leaders from all these student movements together so they can talk to one another about what's going on and how they can help each other. So SCLC gives the first $700, and they bring all of these people, these student leaders, including Marion Barry, for example, who was mayor of Washington, Julian Bond, John Lewis, who is now one of the whips of Congress and is a congressman from Georgia. All these people come in at that time. And one of the things Julian remembers is that one of the things that Mrs. Baker talks about in her keynote in this 1960 organizing conference is that the sit-ins have to be about more than just a hamburger, that it has to be about the economic empowerment of the poor. Now, this is in 1960. The sense that we had coming through SNCC was that, in fact, we weren't about just getting a bigger piece of the pie. That, in fact, maybe parts of that pie were rotten, and maybe you had to bake a new pie. Now, you start seeing this in something that John Lewis did, and this is another. John had to tone down. John Lewis, who was the chairman of SNCC, during the March on Washington, gave the March on Washington speech. The same time, the same march where Dr. King gives his I Have a Dream speech. And he toned it down, but the non-toned down version is in that book. And what he says, opening remark is, "We march today for jobs and freedom, but we have nothing to be proud of. For hundreds and thousands of our brothers are not here. They have no money for their transportation, for they are receiving starvation wages or no wages at all." And then he says, and he's talking about the Civil Rights Bill of 1964, and he says, what is it in this bill that will protect the homeless? John's talking about this in 1963. Protect the homeless and starving people of this nation. What is there in this bill to ensure the equality of a maid who earns $5 a week in the home of a family whose income is $100,000 a year? Now, you hear Dr. King talking about this also. So that, for example, 1 month before Dr. King is assassinated, he says, and this is it's a speech that he gives at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. And this is a piece from something that we use in footage in Eyes on the Prize. He says, "This is America's opportunity to help bridge the gulf between the haves and the have-nots. And the question is whether America will do it. There's nothing new about poverty. What is new is we now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty. But the real question is whether we have the will." He also says earlier, as he's organizing the Poor People's Campaign to Washington, he says, "It didn't cost the nation 1 penny to integrate the lunch counters. It didn't cost the nation 1 penny to guarantee the right to vote. But now we are dealing with issues that cannot be solved without the nation spending billions of dollars and undergoing a radical redistribution of economic power." Now that's what Dr. King is saying in 1968. Not just I have a dream, a radical redistribution of economic power. And it was interesting to me, I heard an interview with former President Carter recently, and he started talking about redistribution of economic power, and I thought, oh my God, I mean, things really have changed a little bit. But in any event, now one of the things that I do also is that I clip the New York Times every day. And I got this because of my work with Julian Bond, who used to do the same thing. It's interesting, by the way, I should mention that when we were working on the Malcolm X documentary, that one of the things that amazed me as you talk to people about him was that he read everything. I mean, the man is not just reading, the 5 daily newspapers. He's reading the National Review. He's reading the Washington Post. And there's a story that one of the secretaries at Number 7 Mosque in Harlem tells about him. And she says, and she was pulled into the nation because of Malcolm. A student who was at that point 14 years old, was going to the High School of Music and Art in Harlem. And she said, he was doing all these media interviews. He was on Beat the Press, he'd be on the Barry Gray radio show. He's doing all this stuff. And so he had to really be kept current about what the current events were. And so she said, he's about to go to this interview. And he says to her, Sister Sharon, could you get this piece on the Congo situation in Africa? And she says, well, I'm sorry, Minister Malcolm, could you tell me a little bit more about it? And he says, well, and he then tells her, well, it says so-and-so and so-and-so, and it was the Herald Tribune, and I think it was October 3rd, 19... To the point where she's wondering, why does he need the article? He has it all in his head. There's another point. As a matter of fact, the person who wrote the narrative for the book that we put out on Malcolm, Professor Bill Strickland at UMass Amherst, knew him. And he said he was amazed because at one point, Malcolm, in talking to Bill, mentioned the National Review, which is not your most left-wing journal. And so he says, well, Malcolm, how come you're reading stuff like that? And is just really appalled. And Malcolm says, well, you have to read all kinds of things in order to understand, first of all, what people are saying, but also because factual information is buried in a lot of strange sources. And he said also, you need to understand what the other side is saying in order to know how to debate them. And Malcolm loved debate. He loved the play of words. And so he's not only reading that, he's also reading Shakespeare, he's reading W.B. Du Bois, he's reading Delaney, he loved intellectual stimulation, and that was amazing to me to hear that from so many different people who knew him. But in any event, okay, that's a sidetrack. One of the things that I clipped was an article in the New York Times. The headline says, "Bad Year, Good Decade for the Rich." And in this it talks about a study, and it said that from 1977 to 1989, the study showed that the poorest fifth of American families saw their income drop by more than 10%. to $8,391, while the incomes of the richest fifth grew by more than 25% to $109,424. Another article that is also from the Times, entitled "Who the Rich Are and What They Should Pay." And what it says in this is that of the people who make $200,000, in 1979, there were 94,000 of them. And they were taxed at a rate, this is adjusted gross income, they were taxed at a rate of 45.3%. 1989, 10 years later, not 94,000, 790,000. And they're not taxed at 45.3, they're taxed at 24.1%.